Hello chaps, Paul Curran here. I hope you and all the listeners are well. I've just enjoyed a conversation with my good friend Marcus, who's planning a trip to Mauritius. Lucky thing. During our conversation, Mark Twain's name cropped up. Samuel Langhorne Clements used several pseudonyms during his long writing career. The first was simply Josh, and the second was Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass. Twain literally means two. As a riverboat pilot, Clements would have heard the name Mark Twain, which means 2 fathoms, on a regular basis. According to the University of California, Berkeley Library, Clements first used this pseudonym in 1863, when he was working as a newspaper reporter in Nevada, long after his riverboat days. Clements became a riverboat cub, or trainee, in 1857. 2 years later, he earned his full pilot's license and began piloting the steamboat Alonzo Child upriver from New Orleans in January 1861. His piloting career was cut short when riverboat traffic ceased at the start of the Civil War that same year. Mark Twain means the second mark on a line that measured depth, signifying 2 fathoms or 12 feet, which was a safe depth for riverboats. The method of dropping a line to determine the water's depth was a way to read the river and avoid submerged rocks and reefs that could tear the life out of the strongest vessel that ever floated, as Clemens wrote in his 1863 novel, Life on the Mississippi. Mark Twain, November the 30th, 1835 to April the 21st, 1910, was a writer, humorist, entrepreneur, publisher, and lecturer. His novels include The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, 1876, and its sequel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, of 1885, the latter often called the Great American Novel. After he visited remote Mauritius in 1896, Mark Twain quoted an islander as saying, "Mauritius was made first, and then heaven, and heaven was copied after Mauritius." Speaking of Mark Twain, reminded me of a sonnet that I wrote at this time of year, April, and it goes like this. It's called Almost May on the Ridgeway, or Sheer Plod Unshod, Never the Twain. Earlier today, out on the Ridgeway, I found myself happy for a few steps, in spite of, or by accident perhaps, the dim distant today. And for those few feet it all stayed that way, just the view, the haze and the buttercups, no thoughts of hard-earned shortage or hardships. April, the breeding season for the jay. Poetic like a kit-smart cathedral, birdsong these mornings could drive me insane, sonic unravelling of bootlaces, an ornithological festival just for me on my lonesome in the lane. Happy, Huck Finn shoeless for those few paces. From a great American to a great Brit, David Herbert Lawrence, whose dates were the 11th of September 1885 to the 2nd of March 1930, was an English writer and poet. His collected works represent, among other things, an extended reflection upon the dehumanizing effects of modernity and industrialization. Some of the issues Lawrence explores are sexuality, emotional health, vitality, and spontaneity. Lawrence's opinions earned him many enemies, and he endured official persecution, censorship, and misrepresentation of his creative work throughout the second half of his life, much of which he spent in voluntary exile, which he called savage pilgrimage. At the time of his death, his public reputation was that of a pornographer who had wasted his considerable talents. E.M. Forster, however, in an obituary notice, challenged this widely held view, describing him as the greatest imaginative novelist of our generation. Later, the literary critic F.R. Leavis championed both his artistic integrity and his moral seriousness. Lawrence is best known for his novels, Sons and Lovers, The Rainbow, Women in Love, and, of course, Lady Chatterley's Lover. In these books, Lawrence explores the possibilities for life within an industrial setting. Though often classed as a realist, Lawrence in fact uses his characters to give form to his personal philosophy. His depiction of sexuality, though seen as shocking when his work was first published in the early 20th century, has its roots in this highly personal way of thinking and being. It's worth noting that Lawrence was very interested in the sense of touch, and that his focus on physical intimacy has its roots in a desire to restore an emphasis on the body and rebalance it with what he perceived to be Western civilization's overemphasis on the mind. Writing in a 1929 essay, he stated, "Now we see the trend of our civilization in terms of human feeling and human relation. It is, and there is no denying it, towards a greater and greater abstraction from the physical, towards a further and further physical separateness between men and women, and between individual and individual. It only remains for some men and women, individuals, to try to get back their bodies and preserve the flow of warmth, affection, and physical unison." In his later years, Lawrence developed the potentialities of the short novel, for example, in his The Virgin and the Gypsy. He was also a tremendous poet, and I want to close this week's Poetry Corner with two short poems by D.H. Lawrence. The first is Hummingbird. I can imagine, in some other world, primeval dumb, far back, in that most awful stillness that only gasped and hummed, hummingbirds raced down the avenues. Before anything had a soul, while life was a heave of matter, half inanimate, this little bit chipped off in brilliance and went whizzing through the slow, vast, succulent stems. I believe there were no flowers then, in the world where the hummingbird flashed ahead of creation. I believe he pierced the slow vegetable veins with his long beak. Probably he was big as mosses, and little lizards, they say, were once big. Probably he was a jabbing, terrifying monster. We look at him through the wrong end of the long telescope of time. Luckily for us. And finally, for all of us who've worked far too late at night behind the bar, this is After the Opera. Down the stone stairs, girls with their large eyes wide with tragedy lift looks of shocked and momentous emotion up at me, and I smile. Ladies, stepping like birds with their bright and pointed feet, peer anxiously forth, as if for a boat to carry them out of the wreckage. And among the wreck of the theatre crowd, I stand and smile. They take tragedy so becomingly, which pleases me. But when I meet the weary eyes, the reddened, aching eyes of the barman with his thin arms, I'm glad to go back where I came from.